57%. That is the number. On November 18, 2025, a polling institute published a study, and within hours that figure was everywhere in France. 57% of young French Muslims, aged 15 to 24, placed the rules of Islam above the laws of the Republic. Party leaders quoted it the same day. One called it an alarm signal. It appeared in a formal written question submitted to the Interior Ministry in the National Assembly. It ran across the front pages. It ran through the television panels. It ran straight into the debate over a bill creating a brand new criminal offense. 6 months later, when the French Senate voted that bill through in May 2026, the 57% was still doing the work. It had become the number that proved France was right. Track where a number like that actually goes, because the journey is the story. It starts as a line in a 74-page PDF. Within 24 hours, it is a headline. Within a week, it is a talking point that no longer needs a source, because everybody has heard it. Within a month, it is being cited in a parliamentary question as established fact, with the figure reproduced, but not the wording of the question that produced it. And within 6 months, it is load-bearing. It is holding up an argument for a piece of legislation, and by that point, challenging it looks like denial rather than diligence. That is not unique to France, and it is not unique to this subject. It is what happens to any statistic that arrives at a moment when a political system is already reaching for one. So we did something that almost nobody arguing about it did. We went and read the study. Not the headline, not the press release. The actual report, the methodology note, and the analysis document that the Institute published alongside it. And what is in there is genuinely more interesting than the number, because 4 separate findings in that same study point in the opposite direction. One sentence in the Institute's own analysis quietly undercuts the entire framing, and the single most quoted statistic in modern French political debate turns out to be measuring something slightly different from what everyone thinks it measures. This is not a debunking. That matters. So let me be precise about it before anything else. The study is real, the Institute is serious, and several of its findings are alarming by any standard. What follows is not an argument that France has no problem. It is an argument that France has spent 1.5 years legislating off a number that most of the people quoting it have never actually looked at. Start with who paid for it, because that is the part that took the longest to find, and it is not in most of the coverage. The institute is IFOP, the French Institute of Public Opinion, founded in 1938. It is one of the 2 or 3 most established polling organizations in France. Nobody serious disputes its competence, and this particular study was unusually well built. The fieldwork ran by telephone from August 8 to September 2, 2025, and interviewed 1,005 self-identifying Muslims, drawn from a nationally representative sample of 14,244 people aged 15 and over in metropolitan France. Telephone, not online panel, which is significantly more expensive and was chosen deliberately to reach people with limited French, limited internet access, low income or low education, groups that online panels systematically miss. It replicated the technical protocol of a 2016 benchmark study so the two could be compared directly. And it defined its population by self-identification, meaning it counted only people who answered Muslim when asked their religion, rather than the older and much criticized method of inferring religion from names and countries of origin, which sweeps in atheists and Christians with Arabic surnames and inflates every figure it touches. That is a well-designed piece of research, and it deserves to be treated as one. Anyone telling you this poll is fake is not worth listening to, and that includes people who agree with you. It matters that we establish this first, because the easiest way to lose an argument about a statistic is to attack the wrong part of it. If your objection is that the sample was too small, you have already lost. 1,000 respondents drawn properly from a 14,000-person national frame is a solid sample and larger than most published polling. If your objection is that you cannot survey Muslims in France because the law forbids religious statistics, you have also lost. The law restricts state collection of ethnic and religious data, not voluntary self-declaration in a private survey. The problems with this study are not in the sampling. They are somewhere much more specific. But somebody commissioned it, and the commissioning body was not the state, not a university, not a foundation. It was a magazine called Écran de Veille, a small monthly publication that describes itself as the Monthly for Resisting Fanaticisms, staffed partly by former journalists from Marianne, and whose contents are, by the description of French public broadcasting, mostly devoted to denouncing Muslim entryism. Now, that does not make the numbers false. A commissioner does not fabricate the data, and IFOP would not put its name to fabricated data. But in survey research, the commissioner does something more subtle and more consequential than fabricate anything. The commissioner decides which questions get asked. And a publication whose editorial mission is documenting Muslim entryism is going to commission a questionnaire that asks about entryism at length, in detail, and from multiple angles, because that is what it wants to know. It will not commission 20 questions about, for instance, employment discrimination. That is not corruption. It is the ordinary economics of polling. Somebody has to pay for field work, and telephone field work on 1,000 people across 4 weeks is not cheap. And the people willing to pay for research into a contested subject are usually people with a position on it. That is true of surveys commissioned by advocacy groups on every side of every issue. But it means a survey is a lens as much as a measurement, and the person paying chose which way it points. There is a useful test for this, and it applies to any poll you will ever read. Ask what the study could have found that would have embarrassed the person who paid for it. If the answer is nothing, you are not looking at research. You are looking at a questionnaire designed to produce a press release. This study does not fail that test completely, and we will come to the findings that must have disappointed its commissioner. But the shape of the questionnaire, the sheer weight of items about religious rules versus Republican law, tells you what it was built to find. And there is a second thing the commissioning arrangement explains, which is the framing gap. IFOP produced a technical report, Écran de Veille produced a story, the press produced a headline, politicians produced a talking point. At each stage, a qualifier fell off, and by the end, the sentence in circulation was substantially stronger than the sentence in the document. Nobody lied at any single step. The distortion is entirely in the transmission. So what did the question actually ask? Here is where it gets genuinely interesting. The framing that traveled around the world was that 57% of young French Muslims put Sharia above the law of the Republic. That is how it was reported. That is how it was quoted in Parliament. And the underlying finding in IFOP's own analysis document is narrower than that. The report states that on family matters, a majority of under 35s, 57%, prioritize respect for religious rules over French law. On family matters. Read that again. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, the treatment of relatives. Not criminal law, not the Constitution, not the authority of the state in general. And notice the age bracket has moved as well. IFOP's analysis attaches that 57% to under 35s. The version that went around the world attached it to 15 to 24-year-olds. There is a separate figure in the study for that younger group, and a written parliamentary question citing the study gives 44% of Muslims overall and 57% of 15 to 24-year-olds saying respect for the rules of Islam matters more than French law. So the figures exist, and we are not accusing anyone of inventing them. But two different measurements on two different populations produced the same headline number, and by the time it reached a television panel, nobody was distinguishing between them. When a statistic gets quoted enough times, it stops carrying its own definition around with it, and it gets more specific still. The French Council of the Muslim Faith, in its formal response, pointed at one of the items feeding into this cluster of questions and made an observation that is difficult to argue with. One of the ways the survey measured whether respondents put religious rules above French law involved ritual slaughter. Ritual slaughter is legal in France. It is a permitted religious practice, and it applies to Jewish citizens exactly as it applies to Muslim ones. So a respondent who answers that they follow religious rules on ritual slaughter is not describing a conflict with French law at all. They are describing something French law explicitly allows. But in the aggregate, that answer contributes to a figure that gets reported as choosing Sharia over the Republic. The rector of the Grand Mosque of Paris put the general problem in one line, and whatever you think of him as a political actor, the sentence is a good one. Ask the questions badly, he wrote, and you always end up manufacturing the fears you claim to be measuring. If you want more of the stories where the number everyone is shouting about turns out to have a footnote nobody read, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because there is one sentence in IFOP's own analysis that almost no French politician has quoted, and it is sitting directly underneath the 57%. Here it is. Immediately after presenting that finding, IFOP's own document adds that this overmobilization is not a trait specific to Muslims. Read that in context. That is the Polling Institute, in its own report, on its own headline finding, telling the reader that the behavior it has just measured is not distinctive to the group it measured it in. It was not buried in an appendix. It is right there in the analysis, a few lines below the number. And in the 18 months of French political argument that followed, it has been almost entirely absent from the conversation. And there is independent evidence backing that caveat up. Patrick Simon is a demographer at France's National Institute for Demographic Studies and a co-author of Trajectoires et Origines, the large-scale state-backed survey of migration and integration in France. Asked about the IFOP study, he made a point that reframes the entire debate. In their surveys, when the equivalent question was asked across religions, they found the same proportions of Muslims putting the Quran before the Republic as Christians putting the Bible before it and Jews putting the Torah before it, the same proportions. Which means that a question of the form, do your religious rules matter more than the law, is not primarily measuring Islam. It is measuring religiosity. Devout people of every faith, asked whether God's rules outrank the state's, tend to say yes. They have tended to say yes for as long as anyone has bothered asking them. So if you survey a population that is more religious than average, and you ask a question that religiosity strongly predicts, you will get a high number. That number will tell you a great deal about how devout your respondents are. It will tell you considerably less about what they intend to do. Simon's wider criticism is sharper still. He argues that a series of recent surveys have set out to demonstrate that Muslims are in rupture with common law and collective values, using ambiguous questions whose interpretation is uncertain, and that these surveys combine factual questions about practice with attitude questions that do not really express the ideological orientations attributed to them. Now hold the other half, because this is not a story where one side is simply right and the skeptics have a real problem of their own. The trend data in that study is not ambiguous, and it is not explained away by question wording. Daily prayer among French Muslims under 25 rose from 26% in 1989 to 67% in 2025. Mosque attendance in that age group went from 7% to 40%. Strict observance of Ramadan went from 51% to 83%. The proportion of Muslim women under 25 wearing the veil rose from 16% in 2003 to 45% in 2025, while among women over 50, it fell over the same period. 38% of Muslims approve of all or part of positions IFOP classifies as Islamist, against 19% in 1998, a doubling. Those are behavioral measures, comparable across decades, using the same protocol. You cannot dismiss them as a badly worded question. And the direction is the direct opposite of what every European theory of integration predicted, which held that religiosity fades across generations. In France, it is running backwards, and IFOP's own conclusion is blunt. At this stage, nothing appears to be halting the process. There is also the finding that most directly concerns French policy. Around a quarter of French Muslims express sympathy for the Muslim Brotherhood specifically, and among young people the figure is roughly a third. Given that the French state spent a year producing a report mapping Brotherhood-linked associations, that is not a number the government can wave away, whoever paid for the survey. But now, the four findings that almost nobody quoted, all from the same study, all published on the same day. The first. On the hardest possible measure, the one with no ambiguity in it, support went down. The proportion of Muslims in France who believe Sharia should apply fully regardless of what country you live in fell from 17% in 2008 to 15% in 2025. Down. On the single question that most clearly describes an actual political program, the number moved in the opposite direction to the headline. The second. Sympathy for jihadism stands at 3% against 52% expressing outright hostility to it. For Salafism, the figures are 9% sympathy against 28% hostility. 3%. The picture of a generation drifting toward violence does not survive the dataset it is supposedly drawn from. The third. 3/4 of respondents said that fellow Muslims have every right to leave Islam. In 1989, asked the same question, fewer than half said so. On apostasy, arguably the sharpest test of religious coercion there is, French Muslim opinion has moved dramatically toward liberalism over 35 years. The fourth, and this is the one that stopped us, 73% of French Muslims in a relationship have a partner of the same religion. For the French population as a whole, that figure is 80%. Sit with that for a second, because it is counterintuitive enough that most people assume it is a typo. It is not. French Muslims are more likely to be in an interfaith relationship than the average French citizen. In a debate entirely organized around the concept of a closed, separate counter-society, the group accused of closing itself off is marrying outside its faith at a higher rate than everybody else in the country. There is one more, and it complicates the veil figure that gets quoted almost as often as the 57. Yes, the proportion of Muslim women under 25 wearing the veil went from 16% to 45%. But the study also asked why, and among those young women, 59% cited sexual or social pressure as a reason, not wanting to attract men's attention, wanting to feel safe. That is not nothing, and it is not a straightforward story about religious revival either. It is at least partly a story about young women in France not feeling safe in public, which is a different problem with a different solution, and it appeared in almost none of the coverage. And one more, which cuts against everyone. IFOP's own polling director noted that the study's findings do not support the champions of the Great Replacement theory, because Muslims make up around 7% of the adult French population. That is a real and growing figure, up from around 0.5% in 1985. It is also nowhere near what the loudest voices in the French debate have spent a decade implying. So we have a study whose headline number is being used to justify an entirely new criminal offense, in which 4 findings in the same document point the other way, and whose own authors added a caveat that the behavior is not specific to the group being measured. Then there is the response, and the response was not good either. 4 departmental Muslim worship councils from the Loire, the Aube, the Bouches-du-Rhône, and Seine-et-Marne filed a legal complaint with the Paris Judicial Court alleging a lack of objectivity. Understand the position that puts them in. Rather than contesting the findings on the substance, 4 religious bodies attempted to use the courts against a survey. Whatever the merits, it is a losing move, and it hands the other side the argument for free, because the immediate reply writes itself. They are suing the messenger. The more serious criticism came from academics, and the more serious response came from the co-president of the French Council of the Muslim Faith, who accepted the findings while warning against conflation, and argued that the answer is proper state-funded training institutes for imams in France, with a common core in secularism and the Republican framework. That is an actual policy position derived from the data, offered by the community the data is about. So what does this leave us with, honestly? It leaves a real finding, produced by a real institute, using a genuinely good method, commissioned by a magazine with a declared editorial position, measuring something narrower than the headline claimed, accompanied by the institute's own warning that it is not specific to Muslims, and surrounded by findings that complicate it, and were almost never mentioned. The religiosity trend is real. The brotherhood sympathy figure is real, and it matters. The rejection of jihadism is also real. The falling support for Sharia as a legal system is also real. The interfaith marriage rate is also real. All of it came out of the same survey on the same day, and France selected one number from it, sheared off the qualifier, and legislated, which is the actual lesson here, and it has almost nothing to do with Islam. When a country wants to do something, it will find the number that lets it. The number does not have to be false. It only has to be quotable, and it has to arrive at the right moment. 57% was both. And the sentence beneath it, in the same document, saying this is not specific to Muslims, was neither. So we want to hear from you. Does it matter who commissions a poll and how the question was worded, if the underlying trend of rising religiosity is real and measurable across 3 decades? Or is this exactly how a democracy talks itself into something, by taking one number out of a report, dropping the caveat that the report's own authors attach to it, and building a criminal offense on what is left? Tell us in the comments. We read them. And if you want the stories underneath the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because the bill that number helped pass is still moving through the French system, and the report it came from is 74 pages long in French and free to download.